I'm Sherilyn Skolnicki, and this is Brilliant Balance, the show for working women who are ready to shine. Each week, I bring you ideas, inspiration, and insight on balance, business, and getting it all done gracefully. You ready? Let's be brilliant. This is episode 227 of the Brilliant Balance podcast. Invest in yourself without the guilt. This is the fourth and final part of our finance series, and today we are digging into investing. So I want to thank you for loyally listening to the 4 episodes of this series. If you have missed one or more of the earlier few, you might want to go back and listen. I think this works best as a sequence, but I know you might find one or more of the topics a little bit more relevant for you. And today's is really a good one. I tell a story at the beginning of this episode that made me smile as I listened back to it because my daughter, who is now 17, was 13 at the time that the story happened. And I think so much of this is still incredibly, incredibly relevant. So I am very much looking forward to sharing this piece with you because I do believe from the bottom of my heart that investing in ourselves without the guilt is something that we all should be thinking about. Whatever that looks like to you, and you're going to hear in this episode all the various ways that that can show up for you and feel exactly right to you. So I am going to get this one started without further ado. Here is part 4 in our finance series. Today, my friends, we are talking about expenses and investments. So before you roll your eyes or yawn, this topic is our 4th and final topic in our finance series. Next week, we're going to sort of get back to other things. But this one was born out of a discussion that I had recently with my 13-year-old. It's just the perfect conclusion to this finance series, I think, because it really is the next frontier for most women. And so I figured, why not start early with my 13-year-old? So we were out for a walk one night after dinner. And this poor kid doesn't get a mom who talks about, the football game or the weather very well. There's always something big and deep to dig into with me. So anyhow, there are a lot of new homes being built around us. So we were out walking and there's this construction going on. And she was curious about the whole process of buying a home. What's the difference between that lot that's for sale and this half-built home with a for sale sign on it, which was a market home from the builder, and one where there's an existing house that might be for sale that you could buy. So we were in this whole kind of real estate education discussion. And she was curious about, what a house would cost and how that cost of paying for the house might compare to rent, sort of on and on. So I was helping her think through, in the context of this discussion, the difference between an expense like rent and an investment like a mortgage, like buying a home. She caught on fairly quickly to the basic concept that an investment is something that has residual worth after it's used. Maybe it even has increased worth after it's used. So, for her, it was this realization that, well, if you bought the house and you paid for the house over 15 or 30 years, at the end of that 15 or 30 years, you had a house to sell, and that got you a bunch of money back. If you had paid rent for 15 or 30 years, of course, at the end of that, there's nothing to sell. And so that money is gone, and there's no return to you for all the years that you have been paying to use that living space. It's a pretty basic concept, right? I'm sure most of you are like, okay, whatever, I get the difference between renting and buying a home. But it was a really simple way for us to sort of anchor into this concept of the difference between an investment and an expense. And then it gave us a framework. We sort of parlayed that into a discussion about other things that you might rent or buy, like a car, if you leased a car versus buying a car and the pros and cons of that. And then we started going through other typical expenses or expenditures and classifying them as, well, would that be an expense or would that be an investment? And as we went, I had this aha moment that I think our definition of investment may be a little bit narrow. Even as adults, we may fairly narrowly define the term investment and, really think about it as financial instruments. So again, remember, my poor 13-year-old is out for this walk with me, and we're in this rather advanced discussion at this point about economics. And I think she was probably very happy when we finally got home that evening. But now we're going to have part 2 of that discussion with you. So today, what I want to know is, how do you classify expenses and investments? If you looked at all the money that passes through your hands every month, which things would you classify as an expense? And which ones would you classify as an investment? Have you really thought about it lately? If you have, that's awesome. This is something I think we probably all should be doing regularly. But if you haven't thought about this or haven't thought about it lately, it's a good exercise to look at all the places that you are taking the money you earn. Where's it going? And in your mind, are you really thinking of those as expenses, or are you connected to the idea of which ones are investments? So when I say investment, most people think about traditional financial instruments, right? Stocks, bonds, mutual funds, retirement funds, things that are financial instruments where you put money in to an investment pool, you let it sit there for a while, and then you earn a return and you get it back, right? Just the word investment is scary to some people because of their lack of knowledge about the space. And here's the thing, as a result, women are way less likely to invest in traditional financial instruments than men. We don't invest as much, and we don't invest as early. So there was this survey done by BlackRock, and of all of the assets that women control, if you look at sort of the total portfolio that you have, your entire collection of ownership, 71% of it women keep in cash. And for men, that number is 60%. So still pretty high, but there's that 11% gap. And they're starting to refer to this as the gender investment gap. It's sort of a twin to the gender pay gap. So, why do we do that? Well, cash feels like it has no risk, right? Cash is going to be cash. We know what we have. But the thing about cash is it also has zero potential to grow. So stocks and other investments they have some risk, but they have potential to grow over time. So the purchasing power of that cash is going to go down over time, right? Which means it has an opportunity cost for holding it. So here was the data I saw. It was fascinating. If for women who are making, let's say $100,000 a year as just a round number, if you look at her opportunity cost of holding that extra cash during her working years, like say from 30 to 65, so it might even be shorter than her total working years, carrying that extra cash has an opportunity cost of about $1 million. In other words, if she were investing at the same rate as her male counterpart over that entire time from 30 to 65, that investment would be worth an incremental $1 million by age 65. That's significant, at $100,000 income. So I think it is certainly important to understand and play in traditional financial instruments as a means of investment. But it's actually not where I'm going to spend most of our time today. So I want to make that point. And then I want to talk about kind of my insight from this walk, which is these 3 other places that money can go that also has a return. It may have a slightly different return financially. It may or may not be as significant as those financial instruments, but maybe it's equally important. And it was this sort of twist in my perspective around investing that I thought might be interesting for us to get into a bit today. So beyond traditional financial investments, which again, I am absolutely underlining are critically important for women to understand and participate in. That's my point of view. If you're not playing in traditional financial investments, basically the stock market and other investment opportunities, it's really something where you want to get educated and you want to begin to play, because the fact that women start there later and play with a smaller percentage of their portfolio is hurting us. And in an era in which women are living longer and often living single, right? Because we're living longer than our male counterparts and the divorce rate is super high. Those two things together, it's really important that you have a level of financial independence that's yours and yours alone. But beyond those investments, there's these 3 other kinds that I want to talk about. The first one that really came to light during the walk was the idea of business endeavors. starting a business, all the costs associated with startup, buying a business, like buying a franchise or buying a building, that you were going to lease, and then growing the business, all of the investments that go into enabling a business to get bigger and generate more revenue and therefore more profit. All of those things are investments. And, perhaps not surprising that it came up in this discussion because I own a business. But as she was asking questions about, well, how do you think about, the money that you might spend to hire a new employee or the money that you might spend on marketing in the business? What is that? Is that an expense or an investment? And it was an interesting discussion, right? Because those two things really should only ever be done if we think they're going to help the business to grow, which means there's a return, which means they're investments. So I think that whole notion of, investing in a business is often when I'm talking to women who are thinking about starting businesses, they are thinking about, and I quote, throwing money away. I just don't know if I can throw that kind of money away. Or they'll say, I just don't know if I can burn that kind of cash. Think about the metaphors we're using there. That is not someone who is classifying this as an investment, right? They are looking at it as, I'm going to burn this money. I'm going to waste it, essentially. There is a implied expectation there that it's not coming back. But what if you were very clear that, starting a business or growing a business is really probably the best investment you could make? Would that change the way you think about that as a viable path? So I think it's really important here that business endeavors are classified as investments in our minds when we're thinking about where we may want to allocate some of our earnings. Do you ever find yourself saying, I just need a minute to breathe? While the whole idea of meditation can sound totally intimidating, I've found that stepping away from the chaos of life, even just for a few minutes, is incredibly restorative. So if you're short on time, but could use a few moments of peace right about now, listen to my 5-minute meditation for working moms. It'll help you clear your head and come back to your day feeling centered and refreshed. Head over to brilliant-balance.com/breathe. Press play and settle in for a few mini moments of peace right now. Second one that we talked about was education. And we sort of expanded this to talk about education as well as things like training and, certifications that you could get. So in her context, we were talking about tuition, right? When I was with my daughter. So the tuition for, a private school or the tuition for a college is an investment. And I think a lot of us would be pretty clear that when we're spending money on our children's education, it's an investment we're making in their future. Maybe you've gotten a real estate license or, like a Six Sigma green belt in the quality space, or maybe you're a PMP in the project management space. All of those kinds of certifications and training curriculums are, I think pretty clearly, we would look at them as there's an investment because we expect, our income may go up or we can get into a new field for having that education. But what about things like, taking a cooking class that makes you faster when you're in the kitchen and gives you the skills to prepare healthy meals? Is that an investment or is that an expense? Right? What about working with a health coach or a personal trainer? And that through doing that, you're able to eliminate diabetes and get yourself off of medications. Is that money that you're spending for the health coach or the trainer? Is that an investment or an expense? What about marriage counseling? What if you go work with a therapist or a marriage counselor and you're able to prevent a divorce and all the associated costs of the divorce, both financial and emotional? Is that an expense in the marriage counselor or is it an investment? So these are interesting questions, right? They're a little bit of gray area of what kind of dividend, what kind of financial return would you have to get to think about these things as investments in your future, in building a skill set or a capability that could improve your life, right? Sometimes these have a financial ROI. Like if you're able to get a degree or a certification that very clearly takes your income to the next notch, Most of us are clear that that's an investment. It has a financial return. But what about when it has a lifestyle return, or when it's a cost avoidance, right? We're able to avoid the cost of divorce or avoid the cost of diabetes in these examples. Does that make it an investment? I think this is really important territory to consider. So for me, these all came out on the side of investments. There is an expected return. It's not always purely financial, but in all of those cases of education, training, developing ourselves, making ourselves better, building new skills, I think those are investments. And then the third one, so it was investments in your business, so business endeavors, education, certification, and training. And then the third one were experiences. How do you think about experiences? And I'll tell you the number one experience that comes up in the work that I do with women is travel. Is travel an expense, or is it an investment? There's other ones. Like if you think about sending your child to a camp experience, maybe in the summer, maybe you send them to, 3 weeks of a sleepaway camp where they just come back like transformed. When I was in junior high, I went to a 3-week overnight camp on a college campus. It was a life-altering experience, really one of those transitional moments I look back on in my life and say, I did not come home from that the same person that I went as, right? So many doors were opened, so many worlds were open to me about what was possible and what my future might look like by being in this intensive experience with other kids who were like me. It was just a really extraordinary moment. So a camp like that, when my parents made the decision to send me to that camp, was that an expense or was it an investment? I would argue the return on it has been extraordinary. What about things like the arts? Getting to go to, a theater production or a musical production or going to an art exhibit. Is that an expense or is it an investment? So I think these are the types of expenditures that are often viewed as frivolous, right? We think about them as like luxuries, travel and events and, participation in the arts. And we use those same kind of terms I referenced before, like, oh, I'm blowing money on this, or I just don't have, $3,000 to throw away. Well, when we classify those types of experiences in sort of the expense bucket, the same way that we would, something that we're just going to consume and not have any residual worth from afterwards. We're barely even going to remember that it happened. It seems like an unfair comparison because some of these experiences have such an enormous return over our lifetime. Travel is one that changes people. The experiences that we have when we're in other parts of the country, other parts of the world, other types of geography expand our worldview. They're expansive experiences that keep us in possibility. That is an investment that is worth making. So in all of these, just like traditional investment vehicles, of course you want to assess the risk and the return. You want to do your homework. But when the risk is low, or when it can be offset, and when the value to you is high, when you can see what's possible on the other side of that business investment, of that experience that you might want to have, of that education or that training or that skill that you're going to build, then you want to lean into those expenditures because they have worth. They have worth that goes beyond the period that you're on the trip. My husband and I went to Italy before our oldest daughter was born. When I can't tell you how many times I think back on that trip and how many little pieces and elements of it kind of had this fractal experience that has shown up over and over again in the years since, and that was 14 years ago. So that is an experience that is still having a return, right? There are still elements of my life that are richer today for having been there. I think that's worth thinking about, worth talking about. It's a little bit non-traditional. So I'm certainly not saying that all of these things have a financial return. They don't, but they have a return to your life. And some of them will indeed have a financial return. The business in particular, some of those education and certifications and trainings and skill buildings, many of those can in fact have a financial return as well. So I think the conversation I want you to be having with yourself this week is really, what is your confidence level like when it comes to allocating money to investments overall? How do you feel when you start to think about those decisions? Both the traditional financial instruments, stocks, bonds, mutual funds, et cetera, and then some of these other three that we talked about today, businesses, education, training, experiences. Do those kinds of expenditures scare you? Do you feel a sense of resistance to making them, or do you get excited when you think about them? So that's all we're going to cover for today. And this is the wrap up of our financial series. So if you got something out of this or any of the other episodes we've done in the last 4 on finances, I would love it if you would take a moment to review the show on iTunes. I'm loving getting these. Like, here's one from Megan that I'll read to you that came in. I am loving these podcasts. I can get a bit of refreshment and refocus by popping this on while I'm doing dishes or laundry. And I feel like I've had a pep session with Cheryl Ann. These podcasts help me keep these principles top of mind and keep me on task with my goals. I love doing laundry or dishes with y'all. Thank you for that, Megan. And how great is that? I think the fact that this medium is letting us just sort of put these little bits of inspiration into our day wherever they fit. I know that's exactly how I listen to the podcasts that I listen to. They fit into my day like little friends who go around with me in the car or on a walk. And even maybe when I'm unloading groceries in the kitchen, it's a great companion and a great way to keep my mind focused on something worthwhile. So if you'll take a moment to review the show on iTunes, I would so appreciate it. That is all for today, my friends. Until next week, let's be brilliant.
This is thepodcastfactory.com.